Photography World, the podcast for everyone passionate about landscape photography. I'm Grant Swinburne and I'll be your guide as we explore the world of landscape photography through the eyes and lenses of photographers, both up-and-coming and seasoned professionals. I like to dig a little deeper into the way they think about their photography, how it fits in their lives and where they see it going into the future. Anna Morgan came to landscape photography via veterinary science, her own practice and a master's degree in conservation medicine from the University of Edinburgh. That research brought photography and conservation together in ways that still shape everything she does. Now based on Vancouver Island after moving from the UK, Anna gravitates toward quiet, intimate scenes and abstract interpretations of the world rather than the grand vistas or wildlife subjects. She chose landscapes partly to avoid disturbing animals and partly because solitude in nature is central to her practice and her well-being. In this episode, Anna talks about Indigenous stewardship and why she avoids sharing precise locations, her preference for intuitive and serendipitous shooting over heavy planning, and how she defines success as opening people's hearts rather than building a large audience. She also discusses running workshops focused on authenticity, creativity, and ecological connection, and the thinking behind her master's thesis on photographers' roles in conservation. I hope you enjoy the show. G'day, Anna. Welcome to Landscape Photography World. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Grant. I appreciate
Real pleasure. Why don't we start with why is Anna Morgan a photographer and why in particular landscapes, why you've dedicated a lot of your photography time to it?
I would say my journey started when I was really young. I picked up a camera because I took art in high school.
Okay.
I come from a family of artists. My grandfather was a sculptor and painter, and so art runs in my blood, I guess. And I picked up a camera because it helped me plan paintings and pottery pieces and things like that.
Right.
Nature generally has always been something that is very dear to me. I'm a vet by profession.
Okay.
Animals of all sorts fascinated me from a very young age. I didn't really think of doing anything else. You know, when I was in high school, the two things kind of evolved together. And then I dipped in and out of photography for quite a few years throughout my 20s. And then in my mid-30s, I started a master's degree in conservation medicine, it's a veterinary master's degree from the University of Edinburgh. And my thesis, I was kind of stumped. I didn't know what to write my thesis on. And my future supervisor said to me, well, what do you enjoy? I was like, well, photography, thinking that would be, a kind of silly answer for
Off topic.
It felt off topic, but he said, well, that's where we'll start. And my thesis was on the role of conservation photographers, or the role of photographers in conservation. That led me, I would say, to a different and deeper thought process on why I photograph. And I guess that's ultimately why I'm here today.
Okay.
As a landscape photographer. Really just, for me, it's about connecting dots, connecting things in the landscape, trying to see the bigger picture through the detail, trying to help people see and understand our complicity in systems and where we fit into that.
Okay. You raised something there that sort of piqued my interest. So with conservation, it's a topic that comes up quite a lot on the podcast. A lot of photographers that I've spoken to have that sort of conservation concept within their work. Some more so than others. Some it runs very deep and so forth. But I guess having that veterinary side of things, why not wildlife? Why landscapes versus wildlife?
I've been asked this a lot. So I'd say there's two aspects to it. One is, and wildlife photographers will clearly argue against this, or at least argue against it specific to them. But I like to keep animals safe.
Sure.
And I think as soon as we start photographing them, particularly in busy locations, and we seek them and we, try to find them. And no matter how careful you are, there's always an element of disturbing, or at least potentially disturbing them.
Hmm.
Um, and I feel that my responsibility is somewhat different to that. So I care very deeply about the welfare of animals, and I have felt, and this is something I've come to think of over a very long period of time, is that by focusing on these details of landscape, I'm actually helping people see a kind of deeper picture, or at least that's the philosophy that goes
Sure.
behind it. So I don't feel I need to photograph the animals in order to tell the story of how we all, animals included, fit into the landscape. The second part is the actual process of doing the photography. I like to photograph to get some silence and some solitude, and to generally have a moment of calm.
Yep.
And wildlife photography, it's either a lot of sitting around waiting, or it's a lot of chasing. And there's, I guess, not as much of the in between, just walking around, wandering, noticing things.
Sure.
So that's the process that I prefer. And of course, there's nothing wrong with any other, there's no judgment on anyone who chooses to do wildlife photography, but it's the practice is just less for me, I guess.
Yeah, I get that. I get that. I'm interested in where the veterinary side of things is now in your life. Is that something you've put aside? Is it something you dabble in? Is it what's that in your life now compared to photography?
Yeah, almost nothing when you look at it on the surface of things. So when I moved to Canada from the UK, the qualifications aren't reciprocal,
Right.
which I guess was a surprise to me, when we were first looking at moving here, being a Commonwealth country and so on. And I had already started my master's at that point. So I thought I had, a potential avenue to move into some kind of conservation work or wildlife work of some sort. Then I went back into it, in management. So I went and managed a couple of larger hospitals, and realized that, having done my master's and having got all this knowledge about, the way life is interrelated across the planet, it just didn't, it felt too businessy. And I had to walk away. But I, the master's conservation medicine it's not a very well known term, conservation medicine. I think
Mhm.
more people understand the term One Health, which is, they're both similar things. So it's how the health and disease of the human aspect, the animal, and the ecological kind of interact. So through my photography, I still think that I touch on a lot of that knowledge, but it's not explicit in the way that it perhaps would have been if, say, I worked as a vet in a wildlife organization.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm trying to sort of work out in my head the balance between where you sort of started. It sounds like the art side of things was very strong very early on. Doing a PhD is not necessarily very artistic. There's a lot of structure in how you've got to put together your thesis, etc., etc. Obviously, if you've got photography as a strong portion of that, you can bring some of that artistic in. But they seem to be slightly unrelated. And as you said at the beginning, when you first raised the question of photography, something I'm interested in, when you started your thesis, how do you blend the two in, and how does the artistic side complement the technical
Mhm.
side of that thesis writing?
What I will say, so firstly, it was a master's, not a PhD.
Sorry.
I'd love to be able to say I have a PhD, but I don't yet. Who knows? But what I think is that in primary and secondary education, and perhaps tertiary education to a degree, at least at the undergraduate level, science is it's taught in a very reductionist and positivist way.
Hmm.
So we're taught that there are rights and wrongs, and that filters down to everything to the way we interact with each other and with the news and so on and so forth. But once you get to postgraduate science education, it becomes much more creative.
Sure.
Science itself is very creative. And then once you start looking at applied sciences and health, you're integrating all these very complex ideas and ideologies that are cross-disciplinary. There's a lot of philosophy in there and other creative thinking ideas. So I would say that at that point, it becomes very natural to go between art and science. And it's rather a way of thinking and a way of approaching things as opposed to a way of learning things,
Yeah. Okay.
if
Okay.
that makes
Yeah. No,
sense.
that makes a lot of sense. In terms of what you're now doing creatively with your own photography, separate to the masters and so forth and the side of things, what are the things that are influencing you the most, and where do you gather your inspiration? What are the things that make you stop and take a look?
I mean, I'm primarily, there's two things. One is simply just being there in the moment and experiencing it for what it is,
Hmm.
whether that's something beautiful or something less beautiful. I like to try and take it all in as it comes. Um, so that's one aspect of it for sure. And like I already touched on, the practice of photography is hugely fundamental to that. I think the second thing for me is like I was saying, it's connecting to these much larger ideas. So we're connected to everything else on this planet,
Yep.
and we often fail to see those connections. We might talk about the bigger obvious things, how, if we're talking about animals, we might gravitate towards thinking about how we're connected with certain mammals in our area, but we fail to look at the insects and the plants. The plants often get overlooked. So we look at the majestic trees, but we forget about the so-called weeds and so on and so forth. So um, I like connecting these ideas and trying to help people understand the interrelations between all beings and where we fit into that, and just really trying to help. A part of it is helping me understand my own relationship to the environment and to each other.
Yeah.
And then, more implicitly than explicitly passing that on to people who enjoy my photography.
Yeah. Interesting. How does how do those personal experiences or emotions sort of influence your work and influence the landscapes you choose to photograph? Are you sort of drawn to particular places, particular sort of environments more than others?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, there's so many thoughts on locations, and I try to not think about locations, but I definitely enjoy certain ecosystems over others for photography. Um, a lot of my work is done on the coast. It doesn't matter which coastline, I don't think. I haven't got to a coast yet where I'm like, oh God, I can't photograph here. They're all got so much depth and so much breadth to them, so many stories. And then I also, although I haven't spent lots and lots of time in the desert, I love going to the desert environments. There's something about the quality of light and the starkness and the assumed simplicity of it, um, that's really enjoyable to photograph. But always I try and see the smaller stories, and it's not so much it has to be small scenes or it has to be intimate landscapes,
Sure.
but that's just what I gravitate to in terms of what catches my attention.
What is it about those that sort of draw you in? What are the things that you're seeing that you go, oh, is it rock formations? Is it combinations of things? What are the sorts of things that sort of catch your eye?
It could be anything. I enjoy how elements interact with each other. So whether that's, water or, light on water, critters on the beach or wind patterns or anything like that. I really enjoy how seeing how one thing relates to another thing, and the kind of understanding that they're not things, but they're processes, they're living processes that, um, are not static, but we see them changing, um, sometimes from minute to minute, and sometimes from, millennia to millennia.
Sure.
But so there's no one specific. Uh, I really don't like the word subject in landscape photography, but that there is no one subject.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Do you have a process for setting creative challenges for yourself? So obviously, with doing your masters, there were specific things that you were looking to do there, and
Hmm.
that may well have influenced that. But do you set yourself creative challenges in your own work, the stuff you do for yourself?
No, not really. Being part of bigger projects like the nature of place, you could argue, is setting a challenge of sorts.
Hmm.
Um, and perhaps, if you're in a challenging environment, I will keep going. But it's not in that case pre-thought through. Um, I haven't. Lots of people talk about stages that they get to where they feel creatively, stumped. And
Yeah.
I've never had one of those experiences. I've
Interesting.
never yet, because you don't know what the future holds, but I've never yet got to that point where I'm thinking, oh, I don't know what to do. So I haven't, I guess that would be one reason to set these challenges. And I haven't really ever experienced that before.
Yeah.
So I guess I haven't felt the need to.
Interesting. Yeah. What about how you think about going out on a photography trip? Are you doing a lot of research and planning, or do you just go out and see what comes and what
Yeah.
comes?
The latter for sure. The extent, and it's evolved over time. So I would say 15 years ago, when I had my clinic, or 20 years ago when I had my clinic, and I had a certain amount of vacation a year, and I would say, okay, well, I've got these 6 weeks, like where am I going to go? And I would plan, where to go, and how you'd move around, where you'd stay, that sort of thing. So there was a degree of planning at that point, but it's certainly become more and more serendipitous as I have continued with photography. And now, while other photographers might be checking their apps to see, okay, well, when's sunset? And as in, what degree of likelihood is there a sunset? I'm just like, well, I'll go out and see what happens.
Sure.
So if it's cloudy, there's just different opportunities. And if it's bright midday sun, there's just different opportunities. There's always something to photograph. And, I'm very happy being out for the vast majority of the day photographing. So I don't feel a need to only go out to plan certain things.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. That, I guess, freedom and the ability to choose subjects, not wanting to use that term specifically, but you know, um, doing that during the middle of the day. A lot of landscape photographers poo-poo bright sunlight and harsh light, and once the sun's above,
Right.
6:30, 8 to 8 a.m. The light's gone, can't do anything. That thinking and that process of looking for things in different lights and different ways seems anathema to a lot of landscape photographers. What
Yeah.
are you looking for in those harsh light conditions or harsher light conditions?
I mean, I would say there's two different ways to look at the harsh light. Either you're graphing the harsh light itself, or you're choosing to find smaller things that are perhaps in the shade.
Yeah,
Some of my favorite images are of, harsh light on water. And, you can get some super contrasty but very effective images just by playing with bright light on water. And, we have neutral density filters in our pockets. Like, why not use them? So there's loads of things you can do directly with harsh light, and the light will reflect off. It's not just water, but leaves and bark and so on. And I think too often a lot of photographers ignore those particular opportunities. And then, like I said, smaller scenes, particularly when they're plants or parts of plants, you can always find stuff in the shade. And if not, I have a circular shade that I just bring out of my bag and
Nice.
hold it over the plant as I take a picture. So, and of course the light will be different. So you might have a more diffuse light and it's not peachy colored or rosy colored, but it's still valid as an art form.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to be honest, most of the population experience nature when they're going out into nature in those sorts of conditions. So
Yeah.
it seems a lot more familiar. It's something I don't do a lot myself. I'm more of a sunrise. I live on the East Coast. Getting up for sunrise, going to a beach is kind of where I'm at. And I like being there because there are very few people around, and you
Mhm.
showing the world something that 99% of the population is never going to see because they're not up at that hour. They're not looking. They're still tucked away in bed, and so it is interesting talking to somebody that does things across that range as opposed to specifically going out for sunrise or sunset or blue hour or whatever.
I mean, that's a really about the number of people on the, being able to go out when there's fewer people is definitely a valid reason to pick your time of day. If those beaches suddenly become crowded at 11 a.m., then I too probably would avoid them at that time, but it wouldn't be because of the light. Yeah.
Mind you, there's still beaches you can. I've been on beaches
Oh
at
yeah.
midday to 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and there's nobody else there. Or there, I think there was one beach I was recently at where I counted there were a total of 5 people, and the beach was about 5, 6 kilometres long. So
Yeah.
plenty of space between the people.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
What I was going to say, though, that sort of leads me to the thing you raised about wildlife photography in terms of not just the number of people that are around, but the number of people that might visit an area and so forth. How do you sort of think about your photography in terms of respecting and minimizing your impact on the natural environment by attracting people to places? It's a topic that comes up quite a bit because and I know in the US, I think they've just recently scrapped in Yosemite the permit system, which I think's absolutely nuts. But some of these things are happening in the world where thousands of people are descending on places because they see them on Instagram or social media somewhere, and they go, "Oh, I've got to go there and get my own snap." How do you sort of think about that topic of geotagging, letting people know where things are and what they're likely to see in a place in terms of minimizing your impact in that way?
I think to a good degree, the style of photography I do, like even if you gave them the exact coordinates, most people wouldn't come away with an image that
Sure.
looked like mine. They would, maybe not 90%, but for a big percentage of my images, people would get there and go,
Where was
what is
that?
this
Yeah.
place? Yeah, it's just a nothing place. And a lot of my images are taken in, nondescript locations. And even within, a national park, I'll often find a location that isn't marked. It's just it could be a busy trail even. But so I guess I have no problem saying I'm in Tofino or I'm in Death Valley National Park because they're already places that people know of. I don't feel comfortable giving people specific locations. I think the whole beauty of being outside is to discover things for yourself.
Absolutely.
Um, I don't view that as gatekeeping. I know that's an argument that people have countered with. You're still in the park. You can choose where you go. There are trail maps that you can go get at the visitor
Well, there's
center.
Google
You
Maps
know,
will show you.
yeah. So
I
so
mean, where
you don't
somebody's taken a 360 cam with them along a trail, you can actually go and see where they've been. You can see the images online.
exactly. But it doesn't make you a better photographer to have that information. And there'll always be people that want to visit we have a lake in BC that was pretty unknown until around 6 or 7 years ago, Joffrey Lakes.
Hmm.
And now it's like inundated with people. And, this year in particular, in it's, it's on Indigenous land. It's managed by provincial parks, but um, it's ancestral land. And so the park has to close to rest for a certain amount of time. And so people can go on to their land and do ceremony and so on and so forth.
Sure.
And this year there's, an argument erupted about how long that should be for. Because, the visitation is so high and it's so sought after that they don't want to close the park for as long. These are things, and that brings me on to the other point I was going to make about locations. So I don't usually give locations at all anyway in terms of the English names. I I don't mind saying I'm in Death Valley National Park,
Sure.
but I'll usually attribute it to the ancestral communities that the land um, belongs to. And so that's another way of, addressing land stewardship.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. A lot of people disregard or don't understand that stewardship and whose land or who originally were the stewards of that land.
Hmm.
Because as you say, national parks, there are national parks, and there's many here where there's cooperations between the Indigenous community and national parks to manage those lands. But there are other national parks where it's just national parks, and there's sort of no local Indigenous community around anymore to provide any of that stewardship. And
Yeah,
I think it's an important point to point out to people that these people were there many years before any white man came along and decided to rename it to Death Valley or whatever.
exactly. Yeah.
In terms of the use of photography as a tool for conservation promotion, if nothing else, what was your sort of finding during that work that you did on your masters in terms of looking at how photographers utilize
Hmm.
their photography and their imagery to promote that conservation message?
That's a great question. Amongst other things, I looked at the work of the International League of Conservation Photographers, and I'm not singling them out
Sure.
in talking about this, but what we tend to find is that reductionist and positivist science that we were talking about previously kind of extends into conservation, and it has the same root as colonialism and patriarchy. So, what we tend to find, or what I have seen, is that very often Western thinking photographers included are kind of continuing that system of colonialism by telling people what the right thing to do is or the best thing to do. Um, and so that's one aspect. And the second aspect is that, if you look and, things change and things have evolved even since I finished that thesis. But for the most part, most conservation photographers are white males. There's a lot of female photographers now, but for the most part, people are white and from, or at least residing in Europe or North America.
Sure.
So there's a very, the diversity of messaging that we see is very low.
Mm.
And often when we have Indigenous voices, for example, it's because somebody else has approached them. It's less likely to be organically done that way.
Sure.
So I, and it's not for me to go in and say, well, you're doing this all wrong. That would be equally harmful, I think. But where it's taken me in my own photography is that I try very hard not to tell people that this is what they should think or this is what they need to know, but to try and ask questions of them, sometimes simply through the image itself, but sometimes, with the words that accompany the image.
Hmm.
Um, and just give people food for thought and questions to think on. And, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just interesting how art can open your mind a little bit and
Definitely.
help you see from different perspectives.
Yeah. I think that's a fantastic point. I've spoken to some Indigenous artists, both here in Australia and overseas as well, and talked about that very same thing about how the cultural and social perspectives influence the way people both perceive the photographs and the images, but also, how little diversity there really is in most, particularly social media, but most Western media around those perspectives and the differences in culture. And I just find it fascinating to understand how people perceive things differently and look at things differently. It's very much top of mind for me when I'm talking to people about how they look at the world. And it's really interesting to sort of hear some of that coming out of your thesis. How effective do you feel you're being in your communications around conservation?
No idea.
Great
Um,
answer. I love that.
yeah, I don't know because, again, I try and steer away from these reductionist, needing to have, I wouldn't want a poll, for example, of like, what did this make you think? I think for me, it's really about broadening someone's mind or perspective, and it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be on a conservation issue per se. It could just be on, how they perceive the river that runs through their town, or, the oak tree that sits at the end of their garden, or whatever it might be. So I would rather, I would rather touch fewer people but have a really deep impact,
Okay.
than necessarily, I've got to reach as many people as I can. Um, so I really have no idea. People contact me all the time to say, they enjoy my work and they enjoy hearing me talk about it and so on. I've never had anyone come back and tell me otherwise. But
Well, that's a good thing.
I know. But I don't know. I don't know how much it impacts, and how on earth would we go about measuring that?
Yeah,
It,
it's one of the things that I've talked to. I've had environmental scientists on the show and various
Mhm.
other people involved in this sort of conversation. And again, it's one of the reasons why I asked the question is because I'm interested in how people perceive whether or not they are or not having any kind of impact in this. Because I think it's really difficult to gauge. You said it beautifully. How would you go about finding out whether or not somebody has actually been touched by an image or the
yeah,
words around an image and what impact that has actually had on them? I do know, though, that particularly on the wildlife front, and things like WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, and so forth, they use those sorts of image, very powerfully in trying to say, hey, well, we shouldn't be mistreating animals in captivity, etc., and those sorts of things. I just find it interesting to try and bring that back to landscapes and the environment and how
yeah.
how people see that sort
And
of
I think,
change going on.
yeah, I think, it's worth just saying, there's qualitative and there's quantitative effects of how images are perceived and so on. And, so you could try and go about it in a quantitative way and say, well, how many things did you change in your life in response to this one photograph? But,
Yeah, yeah.
for me, it's really, how much have you opened your heart to what's around you? And there's no way you can measure that. I mean, how much do you love your children? There's no way you can, it's infinite. And so if it's just simply that somebody has opened their heart towards something new, and then that's had an impact.
What does success look like for you in your photography?
I think that was a pretty good,
Nice.
if my images can lead to, somebody e- exactly that, opening their hearts to what's out there and seeing things with an open mind, that's all I could ever ask for. And it, as I said, it doesn't have to be, I don't need a million followers to
Yeah.
to have that, just knowing that you've touched a few people along the way is sufficient for me.
Let's talk a little bit about the decision to do photography. You mentioned the fact that the veterinary avenue was kind of closed off, but the business side of things, I'm always fascinated with how people make that decision that photography is the life for them, and whether or not they decide to go professional or not. When they make that decision, what are the things going on in their mind around setting up photography as a business, as opposed to just having it as a side hustle or just having it as a pure hobby?
Yeah. I mean, if you want to make money, don't be a photographer.
I think
I,
that's been said very many times.
I, having had my own clinic as a vet, I had a pretty comfortable income, and losing that, albeit a choice, um, was difficult. It was a lot of financial independence there. But the personal circumstances I had was that, I had my children came along, and we decided between myself and my husband that, that we wanted people to be with them
Sure.
and not to simply farm them out to nurseries and so on, to have someone else look after them. So that in part, helped my thinking in terms of the flexibility of being a photographer. And very honestly, my husband has a good job. And so the pressure of the financial aspect was less intense. And I think
Yeah.
without that pressure, it's actually helped me be more successful in my photography as a business, because I can just say yes to the things I want to say yes to and enjoy my photography, without this relentless pressure of needing to say yes to absolutely everything, because, what if I miss out on this possible financial opportunity?
Yeah, yeah. I
Um,
think that ability to say no is very strong for some photographers, being able to say, sorry, that's not for me. That's not where I want to take my photography, or not something that I want to get into.
yeah.
What about marketing and wearing all of the different hats? Because you mentioned that going in and running or managing a veterinary hospital, etc., was probably too businessy.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what anyone says, you've got to have your business hats on. You've got to be the CEO, chief marketing officer, the chief financial officer, etc., etc. That balancing act of having to do the administrative side of things and the businessy side of things, as opposed to the creative side of things, it's always, I think, a challenge for professional photographers and people that want to earn most of their living from being a photographer. And that challenge of swapping hats, doing all of those different things on top of the creative side, what are you doing in terms of your thinking, in terms of how long you're spending on the admin versus how long you spend on the creative side? Have you got the freedom to be more creative because you can say no to things?
Yeah. When I bought my clinic, my husband said to me, "Well, what's your plan for like being successful? Like, how are you going to make this successful?" And I just turned to him and I said, "Well, I'm going to be a bloody good vet." And I think the point I'm trying to make is that word of mouth goes a really long way.
Sure.
And well, in those days, it went further because there was no Facebook to slander you or whatever. But I think when you work hard and you're authentic in what you do, people come to you because they want to learn from you, they want to see your work, they want to understand why you're making these photographs the way you are. And I've approached my photography business really the same way I approach my veterinary business, is that I try very hard not to sell my soul to. And I use social media, but I don't use it intentionally.
Yep.
I don't really go in there with a plan. I'm terrible even at responding to people's comments because it's it drains your energy. And so I'm very bad at using social media. I try to, as far as possible, be as authentic as I can in my newsletters. Obviously, you need to tell people, yes, I've got this workshop available or this book's coming out. But I also like to be as personal as I can be, and So I don't think there's any kind of magic trick to it, but I try not to push things on the marketing front.
Sure, sure. I guess in that there's marketing yourself and what you do versus marketing, say, your images. Are you trying to sell prints? Are you doing more on the education side? Whereabouts is the focus, I guess, on the business?
Well, I guess most of in terms of income production, it would be on workshops. That would definitely generate the most income. Um, I don't have a long-term plan per se as to what it should look like, but I think knowing what to say yes to and what to say no to where it feels right, I think is the way I'm approaching things. Yeah, and in terms of marketing myself, like I said, I just try to be as authentic as I can in all my interactions with people and give what I think is like a heartfelt opinion without putting over what I think needs to happen or
Sure.
how somebody should do their photography themselves.
Yeah. I guess that leans into some of what I want to talk about with running and hosting workshops. I've done a little bit of that myself, and I understand the work involved in setting all of that up, the planning and logistics, and getting people you want to be. What can people expect out of one of your workshops?
I think for the most part, it's, about creativity and deeper conversations on that aspect. I definitely find that from my experience so far, most workshop participants are perhaps less interested in my academic background or thoughts, although
Sure.
we do occasionally lean into those kind of things as well. But really, the deeper conversations on creativity, I think, is something that, I mean, it's certainly not unique to me, but it's something that not all workshops will offer, and
Mm.
just the philosophies about playing with your photographs rather than planning, that sort of thing.
Yeah, nice. What about locations? So I come back to that. Do you have a place that keeps calling you back? Do you have somewhere that you've got unfinished business with that you really want to get to?
Well, I live on one of the most beautiful islands I could ever imagine being
True.
on. Vancouver Island is Um, it's everything I moved halfway across the world to be here. And although there's lots of places I would happily go back and explore, I think, right here where I live is got the most potential for me,
Hmm.
because you can dig deeper into the stories and so on. And it's a pretty big island. Physically, it's a big island. So
Yeah,
so
yeah,
getting around to the different spots and there's enough variation in the ecosystems that you can, I could never get bored. So there's plenty to explore.
yeah. What about the influence of where you're living now on not just what and where you shoot, but also how you shoot? Are there influences that have come about because of your move to Vancouver Island?
Yeah, for sure. We were talking about Indigenous stewardship of the lands, and one of the things that certainly during my research, but it's continued very much since then, is just our understanding of Indigenous ways of knowing. And that's something that, as someone who's British, we don't get any of that, surprisingly enough. Who would have thought that you wouldn't get a study in colonialism in a colonialist country? So or colonizing country. So that has really changed things significantly for me, moving here and really deepening my understanding of what that actually means in practice, meeting people and kind of living and breathing that every day, seeing my children grow up in communities where, they have so much Indigenous knowledge that's shared. So I would say that's been the biggest kind of influence of the change of location.
Yeah, interesting. What about memorable experiences while you've been out shooting? Have you got anything that has stuck out to you and really stayed with you?
I mean, so many. um, yeah, so many. I mean, nature is just amazing, and I think. that I have a lot of images, a huge, like a significant percentage of my portfolio. You know exactly where it was taken, what that moment was, and nothing really feels kind of mundane.
Mm.
But the bright light moments, the interactions of bright light on whether it's water or leaves or whatever, like always stay with me. They're always really great moments. And then, of course, you have the exceptionally fiery sunsets or the moment a particular animal walked across where you didn't expect them.
Yeah,
And you just savored the moment. So there's lots of those moments, but I don't think I could pull out a single one. And
that's okay.
yeah.
What about horror stories? Everyone has their
Oh
sketchy
yeah.
moments. What's happened to you?
Yeah. Oh no. Well, the worst one was I was in Norway. I'm trying to think, like 2012 maybe, and I was in the Lofoten Islands, and I was standing on a beach, and the waves weren't particularly big, and I'd been watching them for kind of 15 minutes. I
Mhm.
always watch them for a while before I take my get my tripod out and so on. And I went to stand on a rock, and it was a good uh 15 meters out from the shoreline.
Sure.
But this huge wave like came and swept me off the rock, and the rock was only,
Wow.
a foot off the ground or whatever. But it swept me all the way up the beach, and of course it was March in northern Norway, so it was freezing.
Mhm.
And so that was pretty awful. I took my card out, my camera immediately, managed to salvage the card, but the camera and the lens and everything was wrecked. The tripod survived, and
Oh,
I survived, which which was the most important thing.
so there was
Yeah, so
no repairing the camera?
no, that when you've got seawater and seaweed churned into the sand, it was a big old wave and completely unexpected.
Yeah,
Um, So these things happen. And so, especially when I'm taking workshops out now, like never turn your back to the ocean,
definitely
always be
not.
aware. Yeah. You
Yeah,
have a long,
safety is very important with ocean photography. It's
yeah,
paramount. One of the things that I sort of do, I've got a set of boots with actual cleats on them, and they're actually sold for rock fishing here. It's a
okay.
big thing around the Sydney area anyway, is where people get up. They're often the only other people I see out on the beaches sometimes, and you have these cleats so that you're not slipping on the black slimy bits and the weed and all those sorts of things. And yeah, there are places I've been where they actually advise rock fishermen to wear life vests. I've I tend to not go out and stand on those rock shelves simply because of that. It's
Yeah,
that's a
sensible.
little bit too hairy for me. But yeah, definitely a good set of cleats and a waterproof trousers, and yeah, it is really something that you've got to sit and think about before you get out there and do those sorts of things.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's talk a little bit about your processing. Are you straight into it when you finish a shoot? Do you leave things to marinate for days, weeks, months, years? How do you go about getting into your editing?
I don't have a particular way of doing things, so it might be the week after or it might be 6 months later. I don't really mind one way or other. I do need to be in the right frame of mind to be processing. So if that frame of mind comes soon and I have spare time and I can do that, then great, I'll get straight into it. I think, I think there is always a valid point about letting things sit for a while.
Hmm.
So even if I have processed them immediately, I won't publish them immediately.
Okay.
I will sit on them for a little while and just go back to them. But you can always go back 3 years later and go, oh yeah, I wish I'd just waited on that one. Or so there'll always be situations like that where you feel it was premature. But I just do whatever feels right in the moment. So if it feels right to get stuck in, then I will do. And if it doesn't, I will just wait until it does feel right.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I love going through back catalogs. I've been doing that
Mhm.
recently. quite a bit, and you find these things that you didn't quite see when you first come home and load it up on the computer. And I normally get in, load them up, make sure they're in a state where they're going to get backed up, and then think about them later. But yeah, sometimes the excitement grabs me, and I go, "Oh, I know that there's a really good one here, and I want to get into that." But you're quite right. Coming back later, you go, "Yeah, I could have done that better. I could have tweaked that slightly
Yeah.
differently." And I think the evolution of people and their processing skills and the tools that are available, etc., those sorts of things. Also, you come back and go, "Oh, there's an image here that I really liked, but there was maybe too much noise because of the high ISO you had to use, but you didn't have the noise reduction
Right.
capability that exists now." Going back, 4 or 5 years, 6 years, you kind of go back to those and say, all right, well, now's a time when I can actually correct some of those technical faults if need.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's always that progression of your skills, and you try new ideas out as well. And going back into back catalogues is, I think, very rewarding in terms of
Yeah,
looking
it
for
is.
things that you missed the first time.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I totally agree.
do you do printing? And if so, do you print yourself? Do you use labs? How do you go about producing as far as I'm concerned, an image really isn't finished until it's printed, but that's
Yeah.
just,
I don't print myself, but I do print. So I have a lab in Vancouver that I know and trust, and I know exactly what I'm going to get when I ask for it, and I can go back to them and ask them to tweak things if I need to. They're excellent at listening to all of that. I do print work. I do sell prints. I put prints up in my own home, and I really enjoy seeing an image in print. I very much miss Europe in terms of art galleries, and so
okay.
um, I appreciate seeing things in person, and there's a connection that you form when you're seeing art in person, whether it's a photograph or a painting or a sculpture or whatever it might be. And so, I agree that having the print is like the final step. But I haven't got into printing myself. I don't print enough to make that worthwhile.
Sure.
And because I know that my printer can do such a great job, I don't feel the need.
Yeah, I get that. I get that. You touched on something that's come up quite a bit in terms of looking at the tangibility of prints, and
Mm.
being able to see that in print is very different to experience it, scrolling through on a phone or on a computer screen. There is a big difference, I think, in the way that you engage with the image. You can take more time over looking at it. The fact that you usually, unless you're looking at a book, which is slightly different, but if you're
Mm.
looking at a piece of art on a wall, you're usually going to take a lot more time looking at that and looking at the various details in the corners or in the center of
Mm.
the image, as opposed to if you're just scrolling through on a screen where, that little 2-inch wide image isn't really going to show you all of that detail and all of the interest in there.
No, exactly. And I think you've heard of the attention economy in
Yep.
terms of, so I think being in an art gallery in a space where you're meant to really pay attention to, it gives you a certain feeling going into the room. And then, like you said, you engage with the pieces in a totally different way
Mm.
to this mindless scrolling that people do. Um, I mean, aside from the way algorithms have got on Instagram and so on, I don't really consume photography anymore via social media because it's just, you can't engage with it in the same way.
Yeah, yeah. It is very much a challenge. That sort of brings me to a topic that I talk about a lot, and photography's place in society. What do you see as photography's place in society? I'm really interested to see whether or not you've got what I think you might have in the back of your mind around that or not.
I mean, photography, so there's two aspects, right? There's photography the process, and there's photographs, the output.
Hmm.
And I think they both do different things in society. I think they both play different roles, if you like.
Sure.
So I think the practice of photography is for the photographer, brings them, if we're talking nature and landscape photography, it brings them a connection, whatever that connection looks like for them, it's a connection, which is a result of the practice as opposed to the output. Um, and then there's photographs which have a different impact or resonance in societies. And obviously, different genres of photography or photographs or images will have a different impact.
Hmm.
Um, Specifically landscape, and then I guess we get into the art versus documentary, and what's the difference, and does it matter question. In terms of the intent that a photographer has with the image, I'm not sure that that is actually so important as, how the photographer connects to the scene in front of them is completely different to the way that a viewer will connect with that photograph. And I don't think that we can put meaning on a photograph as a photographer. I think that comes in the in between. So it's between the person who is viewing and the image itself. So it depends on the context, how they're seeing it, where they're seeing it. But I do think that images play a huge role in society generally, and how systems unfold, and so on. It's a pretty
Definitely. Yeah.
fascinating subject.
Yeah. I think you raised a good point there around the gap between the intention of the photographer and the perception of the viewer. You can't control, as a photographer, you can't control how people are going to see your images. You
Hmm.
can't, well, you can control to a certain degree where they're going to see them, but in terms of their interpretation, that is really going to be up to them. And it's always interesting to me how people perceive that challenge of communicating an idea or an emotion, and people either picking that up or just completely missing the point. And
Yeah.
yeah, it is always a challenge for photographers in terms of how they actually want their images to be perceived.
Yeah. And I think it's a very egotistical way of thinking about your own photography,
Mm,
that someone should look at your images and get the exact same meaning out of them than that you had put on it.
yeah.
I think it was John Berger, um, who wrote that, because everyone's heard the phrase, a picture can speak 1,000 words. And I think he wrote somewhere like, well, it can't, because photography is not a universal language. You actually have to put meaning around it by adding words to it. So, more meaning is given to the photograph by adding the words, and likewise, more meaning is given to the words by adding the image, um, which is quite interesting because, we don't all interpret photographs the same way. We all come from different backgrounds, have different values, care about different things, and, um, we'll see things differently.
Yeah. I think also with abstraction imagery, so where somebody's taken
Mhm.
either a small intimate scene or taken a larger scene, but then done something abstract like ICM or something along those sorts of lines, where the reality of, or the documentary side of things is taken away from the viewer, that intentionality can impact how people perceive that landscape or what it is that they're looking at.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said, that can be very intentional on the part of the photographer. But back to what I said earlier on, is that it's about asking questions. Good art doesn't tell you the answers, it questions.
Yeah, yeah.
So having that mystery and that ambiguity is enough of a thought-provoking piece
Mm.
to get people seeing
Letting people
differently.
decide for themselves what that
Yeah,
actually is, I think, an important way of communicating. It might communicate not necessarily what you think you're going to communicate, but
yeah.
it is interesting how people perceive that. Talking about photography, what's its future? Where do you see it going in the future?
Well, again, photography is a doing, it's a verb, it's about the practice and the doing of photography. So I don't think the technology will evolve and change, and people will have opinions as they always have done on that. But the way we immerse ourselves in the act of photography is not going to go anywhere, I don't think.
Yeah.
People will adapt, of course, to the technology. And I mean, we're seeing, I guess, for want of a better word, like a diversification of thoughts. You know, a lot of people are going back, if you like, to analog. People are thinking about non-camera photography, alternative processing, you know, through plants and so on and so forth.
Yep.
And then you've got people embracing the other aspect and using AI and so on. But I think that there is legitimacy in all of those things.
Yep.
You don't have to like the process or like the outcomes, but they are legitimate ways of engaging. So, yeah.
Are there any photographers that I need to be talking to on the podcast? Who else is of interest?
I took a brief look through your list of who has been on, but I didn't get through all 65 or however many it was. But, I always like to see, I mean, we tend as photographers to, to look at our closest colleagues and recommend them. But I think,
Sure.
There's huge interest in that diversity that we were talking about. So, I mean, I'm running a workshop next year with him, Paulo Valdivia. He's
Okay.
based in Chile, and his work's beautiful, very quiet, very based in his home place, and I think that's really wonderful. And then there's lesser known photographers, Saikat Chakrabarti. His work's beautiful as well, extremely well thought through, and yeah, I mean, I could probably think of a few others. There's a Spanish photographer, Jaume Llorens, um,
I've seen
who's,
some of his work. Yeah.
yeah, it's again very well thought through, very intriguing, very unique in the way he's approached with his diptychs. Yeah,
All
I'm
right.
sure I can think of more, but hopefully that will.
No, that'll do for now. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. My last question is one that everyone on the podcast needs to know the answer to. Do you like pineapple on pizza?
Yeah, I'll take pineapple on pizza.
Nice.
Yeah, why not?
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, Anna. It's been wonderful getting to know you a little bit better and understand some of why you do what you do. Where can people find your work?
On my website primarily, annamorgan.ca. So you can find my portfolios and ebooks and so on there.
Excellent. Thanks very much for being on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks again for listening to Landscape Photography World. I hope you enjoyed the show and keep listening because I'll be joined by some great guests in upcoming episodes. You can find my work in this podcast at grantswinburnephotography.com. I'm also on a whole load of social media. Just look for Grant Swinburne Photography and you'll find me. Keep listening. Make sure you share. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, etc. All of those typical things. Just get other people listening to the show. I'd really like to expand the audience as much as possible and get the good word out there about what these photographers are talking about. I'm Grant Swinburne. I hope to see you out shooting soon.